Hello everyone. Today we'll study the very famous short story written by Catherine Mansfield, A Cup of Tea. So let us know about Catherine Mansfield. Catherine Mansfield Murray. She was born on 14 October 1888 and died on 9 January 1923. She was a prominent New Zealand modernist short story writer and poet who was born and brought up in a colonial New Zealand and wrote under the pen name of Catherine Mansfield. At the age of 19, she left New Zealand and settled in England, where she became a friend of writers such as D.H. Lawrence and Virginia Woolf. Mansfield was diagnosed with extrapulmonary tuberculosis in 1917. The disease claimed her life at the age of 34. So, let us know the summary of the story. So, in this story, A Cup of Tea, Catherine Mansfield dramatizes the jealousy, the universal human feeling. Rosemary Fell is a character in this story. She picks up a beggar girl of astonishing beauty, brings her home to tea, only to realize that her husband has felt irresistibly drawn towards her pickup. The poor girl is then instantly disposed of with a cash gift of £3. So let us read the story in detail. Rosemary Fell was not exactly beautiful. No, you couldn't have called her beautiful pretty. Well, if you look her pieces, but why be so cruel as to take anyone to pieces? She was young, brilliant, extremely modern, executively well dressed, amazingly well read in the newest of the new books, and parties were the most delicious mixture of really important people and artists, quaint creatures, discoveries of her, some of them too terrifying for words, but others quite presentable and amusing. Rosemary had been married 2 years. She had a duck boy. No, not Peter, Michelle, and her husband absolutely adored her. They were rich, really rich, not just comfortably well off, which is odious and stuffy and sounds like one's grandparents. But if Rosemary wanted to shop, she would go to Paris as you and I would go to Bond Street. If she wanted to buy flowers, the car pulled up at that perfect shop in Regent Street, and Rosemary inside the shop just gazed in her desert, rather exotic way and said, I want those and those and those. Give me 4 bunches of those and that jar of roses. Yes, I will have all the roses in that jar. No, no, lilac. I hate lilacs. It got no shape. The attendant bowed and put up the lilac out of sight as though this was only true. Lilac was dreadfully shapeless. Give me those stumpy little tulips, those red and white ones. And she was followed to be the car by the thin shop girl staggering under the immense white paper armful that looked like a baby in long cloths. One winter afternoon, she had been buying something in a little antique shop in Curzon Street. It was a shop she liked. For one thing, one usually had it to oneself, and then the man who kept it was ridiculously fond of serving her. He beamed whenever she came in. He clasped his hand. He was too so gratified he could scarcely speak flattery. Of course, all the same, there was something. Yeah, you see, madam, you would explain he would explain in his low, respectful tones, I love my things. I would rather not part with them than sell them to someone who does not appreciate them, who has not that fine feeling which is so rare. And breathing deeply, he unrolled a tiny square of blue velvet and placed it on a glass counter with his pale fingertips. Today it was little box. He had been keeping it for her. He had shown it to nobody as yet, an exquisite little enamel box with a gaze so fine it looked as though it had been baked in cream. On the lid, in a minute creature stood under a flowery tree, and a more minute creature still had her arms round his neck. Her hat, really no bigger than a geranium petal, hung from a branch. It had green ribbons, and there was a pink cloud like a watchful cherub floating above their heads. Rosemary took her hands out of her long gloves. She always took off her gloves to examine such things. Yet yes, she liked it very much. She loved it. It was a great duck. She must have it. And turning the creamy box, opening and shutting it, she couldn't help noticing how charming her hands were against the blue velvet. The shopman, in some dim caravan of his mind, may have dared to think so too. For he took a pencil, leant over a counter, and his pale, bloodless fingers crept timidly towards those rosy, flashing ones as he murmured gently, if I may venture to point out to madam the flowers on the little lady's bodies. Charming. Rosemary admired the flowers, but what was the price? For a moment the shopman did not seem to hear. Then murmurs reached her. 28 guineas, madam. 28 guineas. Rosemary gave no sign. She laid the little box down and she buttoned her gloves again. 28 guineas, even if one is rich. She looked vague. She stared at a plump tea kettle like plump hen above the shopman's head, and her voice was dreamy as she answered, well, keep it for me. Will you? I'll. But the shopman had already bowed, as though keeping it for her was all any human being could ask. He would be willing, of course, to keep it for her forever. The discreet door shut with a click. She was outside of the shop, gazing at the winter afternoon. Rain was falling, and with the rain, it seemed dark came too, spinning down like ashes. There was a cold, bitter taste in the air, and new lighted lamps looked sad. Sad were the lights in the houses supported dimly. They burned as if regretting something, and people hurried by, hidden under their hateful umbrellas. Rosemary felt a strange pang. She pressed her muff against her breast. She wished she had the little box to cling to. Of course, the car was there. She had only to cross the pavement, but still she waited. There are moments, horrible moments in life, when one emerges from shelter and looks out, and it's awful. One out not to give way to them. One ought to go to home and have extra specialty, but at the very instant of thinking that a young girl, then dark, shadowy, where had she come from, was standing at Rosemary's elbow, and a voice like sigh, almost sigh, like a sob, breathed, "Madam, may I speak to you in a moment?" "Speak to me." Rosemary turned. She saw a little battered creature with an enormous eye, someone quite young, no older than herself, who clutched at her coat collar with reddened hands and shivered as though she had just come out of the water. "Ma'am," staggered the voice, "would you let me to have a price of a cup of tea?" A cup of tea? There was something simple, sincere in that voice. Is what it was not in the least the voice of the beggar. "Then have you no money at all?" asked Rosemary. "None, madam," came the answer. How extraordinary! Rosemary peered through the dusk and the girl gazed back at her. How more than extraordinary, and suddenly it seemed Rosemary such an adventure. It was like something out of a novel of Dostoevsky. This meeting in the dusk. Supposing she took the girl home, supposing she did do one of those things she was always reading about seeing on the stage, what would happen? It would be thrilling. And she heard herself saying afterwards, to the amazement of her friends, "I simply took her home with me." And she stepped forward and said to that dim person behind her, "Come home, tea with me. Come home to tea with me." The girl drew back, startled. She even stopped shivering for a moment. Rosemary put out a hand and touched her arm. "I mean it," she said, smiling, and she felt how simple and kind her smile was. "Why wouldn't you do? Come home with me now in my car and have tea." You don't mean it, madam," said the girl, and there was a pain in her voice. "But I do," cried Rosemary. "I want you to please me. Come along." The girl put her fingers to her lips and her eyes devoured Rosemary. You are not taking me into the police station," she stammered. "The police station," Rosemary laughed out. "Why should I be so cruel?" "No, I only want to make you to warm to and to hear anything you care to tell me. Hungry people are easily led." The footman held the door, all the car open, and a moment later there was skimming through the dusk. "There," said Rosemary. There, said Rosemary. She had a feeling of triumph as she slipped her hand through the velvet strap. She could have said, "Now you all I have got you," as she gazed at the little captive she had knitted. But of course she meant it kindly. Oh, more than kindly. She was going to prove to this girl that wonderful things did happen in life, that very good mothers were real, and that rich people had hearts, and that women were sisters. She turned impulsively, saying, "Don't be frightened. After all, why shouldn't you come back with me? We are both women. If I am the more fortunate, you ought to be expect." But happily at that moment, for she didn't know how the sentence was going to end. The car stopped. The bell was rung. The door opened, and with a charming, protecting, almost embracing moment, Rosemary drew the other into the hall. Warmth, softness, light, a sweet scent, all those things so familiar to her, she never even thought about them. She watched that other receive. It was fascinating. She was like the rich little girl in the nursery with all the cupboards to open, all the boxes to unpack. Come upstairs," said Rosemary, longing to begin to be generous. Come up to my room." And besides, she wanted to spare these poor little things from being stared at by the servants. She decided as they mounted the stairs she would not even ring to Jane, but take off her things by herself. The great things were to be natural. "And there," cried Rosemary again, as she reached her beautiful big bedroom with the curtains drawn and fire leaping on her wonderful lacquer furniture, her gold cushions and primrose and blue rugs. The girl stood just inside the door. Seemed dazed, but Rosemary didn't mind that. Come and sit down, she cried, dragging her big chair up to the fire. This comfy chair. Come and yet get warm. You look so dreadfully cold. I dare not, madam, said the girl, and she edged backwards. Oh, please. Rosemary ran forward. You must be not frightened. You must not really. Sit down. When I have take off my things, we shall go into the next room and have tea and be cozy. Why are you afraid? And gently she half pushed and thin fingers into his deep cradle. But there was no answer. The girl stayed just as she had been put, with her hands by her sides and mouth slightly open. To be quite sincere, she looked rather stupid, but Rosemary wouldn't acknowledge it. She leaned over her, saying, wouldn't you take off your hat? Your pretty hair is all wet, and one is so much more comfortable without a hat, isn't one? There was a whisper that sounded like, very good, madam, and the crushed hat was taken off. And let me help you off your coat, too, said Rosemary. The girl stood up, but she held on to the chair with the one hand and let Rosemary pull. It was quite an effort. The other scarcely helped her at all. She seemed staggered like a child, and was though thought came and went through Rosemary's mind that if people wanted helping, they must respond a little, just a little, otherwise it became very difficult indeed. And was she to do with the coat now? She left it on the floor and had to. She was just going to take cigarette off and mental peace when the girl said quickly but so lightly and strangely, I am very sorry, madam, but I am going to faint. I shall go off, madam, if I don't have something. Good heavens, how throat. How thoughtless I am. Rosemary rushed to the bell. Tea, tea, tea at once, and some brandy immediately. The maid was gone again, but the girl almost cried out, no, I don't want no brandy. I never drink brandy. It's a cup of tea I want, madam. And she burst into tears. It was a terrible and fascinating moment. Rosemary knelt beside her chair. Don't cry, poor little thing, she said. Don't cry. And she gave the other her lace handkerchief. She really was touched beyond her words. Beyond words, she put her arm round those thin bird like shoulders. Now, at last, the other forgot to be shy, forgot everything except that they were both women, and gasped out, I can't go on no longer like this. I can't bear it. I can't bear it. I shall do away with myself. I can't bear no more. You shall not have to. I will look after you. Don't cry anymore. Don't you see what a good thing it was that you met me? We will have a tea and you will tell me everything, and I shall arrange something. I promise. Don't do do stop crying. It's so exhausting. Please. The other did stop just in a time for Rosemary to get up before the tea came. She had the table placed between them. She piled the poor little creature with everything, all the sandwiches, all bread and butter, and every time her cup was empty, she filled it with tea, cream, and sugar. People always said sugar was so nourishing. As for herself, she didn't eat. She smoked and looked away tactfully so that the others should not be shy. And really, the effect of that slight meat was marvelous. When the tea table was carried away, a new being, a light, frail creature with a tangled hair, dark lips, deep lighted eyes, lay back in the big chair in a kind of sweet languor. Looking at the blaze, Rosemary lit a fresh cigarette. It was the time to begin. And when did you have your last meal? She asked softly, but at that moment the door handle turned. Rosemary, may I come in? It was Philip. Of course, he came in. Oh, I am so sorry, he said, and stopped and stared. It is quite all right, said Rosemary, smiling. This is my friend Mrs. Smith, madam, said the long, languid figure, who was strangely still and unafraid. Smith, said Rosemary, we are going to have a little talk. Oh, yes, said Philip. Quite. And his eyes caught sight of the coat and hat on the floor. He came over the fire and turned his back to it. It's beastly afternoon. It is a beastly afternoon, he said curiously, still looking at that listless figure, looking at its hands and boots, and then Rosemary again. Yes, isn't it? Said Rosemary enthusiastically, while Philip smiled his charming smile, and as a matter of fact, as said he, I wanted you to come into the library for a moment, would you? Will Mrs. Smith excuse us? The big eyes were raised onto him, but Rosemary answered for her, of course she will, and they went out of room together. I say, said Philip, when they were alone. Explain, who is she? What does it all mean? Rosemary, laughing, leaned against the door and said, I picked up in the Curzon Street. Really, she is a real pick up. She asked me for the price of a cup of tea and I brought her home with us. But what on earth are you going to do with her? Cried Philip. Be nice to her, said Rosemary quickly. Be frightfully nice to her. Look after her. I don't know how. We have not talked yet, but show her, treat her, make her feel. My darling girl, said Philip, you are quite mad, you know. It simply can't be done. I know you say that, retorted Rosemary. Why not? I want to. Isn't that our reason? And besides, once always reading about these things, I decided. But, said Philip slowly, and he cut the end of the cigar. She is so astonishingly pretty. Pretty Rosemary was so surprised at that she blushed. Do you think so? I had not thought about it. Good Lord, Philip struck a match. She is absolutely lovely. Look again, my child. I was bowled over when I came into your room just now. However, I think you are making a ghastly mistake. Sorry, darling, if I am crude and all that, but let me know if Miss Smith is going to dine with us in time for me to look up the Milliner's Gazette. You absurd creature, said Rosemary, and she went out of her library, but not back to her bedroom. She went to her writing room and sat down at her desk. Pretty, absolutely lovely, bowed over. Her heart beat like a heavy bell. Pretty lovely, she drew her checkbook towards her, but no checks would be no use. Of course, she opened a drawer and took out £5 notes, looked at them, put two bags, and holding it three squeezed in her hand, she went back to her bedroom. Half an hour later, Philip was still in the library when Rosemary came in. I only wanted to tell you, said she, and she leaned against the door again and looked at him with her dazzled exotic gaze. Miss Smith wouldn't dine with us tonight. Philip put down the paper. Oh, what happened? Previous engagement? Rosemary came over and sat down on his knees. She insisted on going, said she. So I gave the poor little thing a present of money. I couldn't keep her against her will. Could I? She added softly. Rosemary had just done her hair, darkened her eyes a little, and put her pearls. She put up her hands and touched Philip's cheeks. Do you like me? She said, and her tone, sweet, husky, troubled him. I like you awfully, he said, and he held her tighter. Kiss me. There was a pause. Then Rosemary said dreamily, I saw a fascinating little box today. It cost 28 guineas. May I have it? Philip jumped her on his knee. You may, little wasteful one, said he. But that was not really what Rosemary wanted to say. Philip, she whispered, and she pressed his head against her bosom. Am I pretty? And here story ends. So this is the story. I hope you liked it. Thanks a lot for watching. Please like and subscribe.